leadership, resistance against male advisors and usurper in the tragedy Dido of Charlotte von Stein. How can a feminine queen be in the 18th century? How can a feminine reign function? How does a female differ from a male leadership? These questions arise when one thinks, for example, of Schiller's Maria Stuart, where queens repeatedly invoke masculine attributes and being depicted more masculine. Furthermore, feminine queens in governing roles, and not just as a wife of a king and thus solely in a consulting position, are rarely found in literature, let alone in drama. But this is different in Charlotte von Stein's Dido, which I will present today. With the protagonist Dido, Charlotte von Stein creates a female model of fool in which the queen remains true to herself, resists through action, and at the same time ensures the welfare of the people. In this within her lifetime unpublished tragedy written in 794, the female model of rule is characterized above all by gentleness, kindness, and non-violence. This kindness is described by her confidence as a central feature of Didos reign. Königin, du bist eine weise Frau und wir lassen uns gern von dir leiten und verehren deine Befehle. Aber allzu viel Güte. Glaube mir, ahme auch darin den Göttern nach, die uns einen Haufen von Übeln lassen. Lauter Güte von ihnen und gewiss, wir stürzten selbst die Götter vom Thron. Act 1, Scene 6. Here on the one hand, kindness is highlighted as Dido's central nature. Moreover, it also shows that under Dido's rule, the people can live in prosperity, free from fear. On the other hand, skepticism towards this concept of rule is clarified by her own advisors. Dido's decision regarding her rule repeatedly met with resistance, whether from her advisors, the people, or the scholars in her court. Her advisors seek to convince her that there is only one way to resolve the central conflict of the drama, the threat posed by Jarvis. Yet Dido remains true to her decisions and her nature. There is no popular uprising against Dido as prophesied by the council, although, as I shall explain later, there is indeed a popular uprising in the drama, which is directed against the usurper Jabez and not against Dido and her rule. Dido remains true to her values and decisions. After the death of her husband Acherbas, she has vowed never to marry again. Cf. Act 2, Scene 4. All her advisors urge her to do so, pointing out that the marriage to Jabez would be the only way to avoid war. But Dido thinks ahead and seeks an alternative that would be the best for the people and where at the same time she would not have to betray her values. Jabez as king would represent a deterioration for Karthag. Es blüht alles um mich herum. Alles ist im Wohlstand. Mein Volk, meine Seemacht, alle Hantierungen. Es dringt keine Stimme des Mangels mehr zu meinem Ohr. Anbieten muss ich meine Hilfe. Es ist auch nirgends eine dringend Not. Auch Künste und Wissenschaften aus meinem geliebten phönizischen Vaterland schlagen hier Wurzeln, ohne wie dort im übermütigen Tyrus auszuarten. Es ist alles glücklich. At the beginning of the drama, Dido describes the situation of her country, Karthag, which flourishes under her rule in a monologue. 3 scenes later, Karthag is clearly distinguished as a land of Aufklärung, enlightenment, from the surrounding barbarian lands, the land of Jabez. This makes the initial situation of the drama unique, as it depicts a country with an enlightened, virtuous ruler who must defend herself against external threats, and resists them in order to uphold her values. Dido recognizes the danger Jabez poses to the people and describes his style of governance as Torheit, folly. Jabez is constructed as a contrast to Dido. Whilst Dido kindness and virtue are emphasized, Jabez is portrayed as immoral, seeking only to enrich himself with the treasures of Karthag. He himself says, Es ist ein Besonderding um die Tugend. Ich kann mir den Begriff nicht recht von ihr machen. The contrast between the nature of men and that of women is articulated in the play itself by Alyssa. O zerstörendes Geschlecht! Ohne euch wäre uns die Kriegslust unbekannt. Warum gabst du, Natur, den Männern dieses Treiben, diese Tatensucht, um den ruhigen Gang nach einem besseren Ziel, wozu deine Ewigkeit dir genug Zeit lässet, widrig zu stören? This statement anchors war in the propensity for violence in the nature of men. Consequently, the lust for war is not portrayed as something that men can choose to resist. Yet at the same time, this statement presents female rule as peaceful and non-violent. Furthermore, Dido's rule is free from fear, from intrigue. Another defining feature of Dido's reign is her ability to transform the way of thinking of those in her immediate circle. The chancellors themselves say, der große Haufen begreift nicht die zarten inneren Gefühle, nur die, die sich dir nähren, die selbst durch dein Wesen dazu umgebildet wurden. Through her nature, Dido can persuade people to change their minds. Dido's resistance is characterized by her remaining true to herself and living a positive example to others, while at the same time achieving success. Dido's rule has a lasting effect, raising awareness of feelings. Dido's chancellors put themselves in Dido's position and endeavor to view the situation from Dido's perspective. This underlines Dido's role as a role model and at the same time the importance of a ruler serving as a role model. This is also highlighted as a difference between Dido and Jarbas. The general, Jarbas' close confidant, criticizes his ruler's failure to set a good example, which is the decisive reason for him to turn away from Jarbas and free Dido's confidence from Jarbas' captivity. Die glänzenden Ansichten von Feinheit des Herzens und Verstandes hatten mich an ihn gezogen, aber da sich seine Gesinnungen untereinander und so auch seine Handlungen widersprechen, so ist mein Herz von ihm abgefallen wie die Frucht vom Baum. At the same time, the general emphasizes in Act 5, Scene 4, das Beispiel der Könige ist der sicherste Lehrmeister fürs Volk. Being a role model is portrayed as a key element of rule in this drama. This exemplary role is simultaneously linked to the virtue, intellect, and emotion of the ruling figure. From this perspective, Dido is the ideal ruler, since women are characterized as virtuous figures in this era. It simultaneously underlines the strength of female rule. However, the role model effect takes time and requires closeness to the ruler to Dido herself as a person. This is why the people themselves do not yet see the dangers posed by Jarbas and do not understand why Dido does not wish to marry him, neither the motivation stemming from her own emotional state, nor the motivation that it would mean protection for the people. Central to Dido's rule is also the fact that she does not rule for her own enrichment or happiness, but for the good of the people. While at the beginning of the drama, Dido is portrayed as unhappy in her monologue. She misses her husband, whom she had loved with all her heart. O mein Akerbas, mit dir ward mir ein Weltall geraubt. Despite these feelings, Dido rules responsibly and led her country to prosperity. In her public duty, Dido does not give in to the grief which is deeply rooted within her. She distinguishes between her feelings as a private individual and her public role. She confesses this deep grief only in her monologue, not even in a dialogue with her close confidant Elissa. This again contrasts with Jarbas, who also acts out of greed and seeks to acquire the treasures of Kartak. This underlines Dido's sense of responsibility as a ruler, while she sets aside her own feelings when acting as a ruler. The vow of fidelity to her husband is also consistent with this thesis, as Dido simultaneously acts as an exemplary public figure for the values of the Enlightenment are decisive. Dido herself distinguishes between the vow of fidelity and her heart. Because of the vow of fidelity, she no longer has a free heart she could consult or give Jarbas for marriage. Here too, values outweigh her feelings in public decisions. Additionally, Dido herself had become queen without her husband. This is inherent in the character of Dido through her backstory in the mythological versions. Dido fled Tyrus with her confidence and founded Kartak herself through the ruse with the cowhide, thereby gaining power. Thus, Dido's rule is not based on a man and is not inherently masculine. The femininity of Dido's model of rule is particularly striking when compared to contemporary drama such as Schiller's Maria Stuart. Unlike Maria or Elizabeth, Dido does not possess a male soul. Elizabeth is perceived by the male characters of the play as unfeminine and undesirable, and she boasts, regiert zu haben wie ein Mann und wie ein König, verse 1170. Maria Stuart also uses the term König, king, to refer to herself. Dido, on the other hand, does not claim to be masculine, nor do her advisors refer to her masculine, but rather to her feminine qualities. At the same time, Dido's femininity is not embodied. Her body is not described and she is not sexually charged. This also contrasts with Maria Stuart. She is the recipient of ardent glances and is regarded with sight and delight. Moreover, Mary's clothing and manner are also highlighted in the marginal notes. Mary's dignity and bearing are linked to her clothing, which is often imbued with political and religious symbols. However, the usurper Jabez does not desire Dido for her appearance, but for her rule. He himself says that he is incapable of love. Consequently, Dido is never elevated to the status of a sex object by a single character throughout the entire play. This is a crucial difference from the well-known plays by male authors such as Schiller's Maria Stuart or Goethe's Iphigenia. Even in Caroline von Günderrode's Hildgund, this difference is represented as Hildgund is desired by both Walter and Attila the Hun. Furthermore, the only way to achieve the throne is to marry Dido, which legitimizes her rule. The fact that Dido is not elevated to the status of a sex object is in the play is also rooted in the choice of the source material. For Charlotte von Stein's primary source is not Virgil's Aeneid, but Justine's Epitome Historiarum Philippicarum. Thus the focus is not on Dido's unhappy love, but she is presented as a strong ruler who first resisted her brother Pygmalion and subsequently also resisted the Mexican king Hieras. Charlotte von Stein gives the people their own voice by visibly depicting their resistance on stage. The people's resistance is portrayed in the 7th and 8th scenes of the 4th act. In addition, the people's wishes are mentioned in several scenes that are repeatedly emphasized. A special fact about this drama is that the representatives of the people speak for themselves and the descriptions are not outsourced to messengers. The people besiege a house where Jabez's soldiers are holding the chancellors captive. The views and demands of the people play an important role in the drama from the very beginning. The chancellors emphasize, for instance, that the people are demanding Dido's marriage, and that they will not understand Dido's reason for refusing to marry. Dido's influence over her people was therefore not yet great enough for them to share her sensitive feelings and motivations. So habe ich also nicht genug getan. So habe ich mir nicht so viel Liebe von ihnen erworben, dass sie mich gegen die Gewalt eines Nachbars schützen, der meine Hand aus Raubsucht begehrt. Thus, Dido sees her role as a ruler also as involving having a positive influence on her people. At the same time, this response underlines the kindness Dido shows towards her people and the fact that she reflects on the causes of the people's behavior in her own decisions and character as a ruler. The will of the people is ambiguous. On the one hand, they wish for Jabez as their ruler and do not want a female autocrat, yet on the other hand, they would not accept Jabez without Dido, a fact that becomes clear in the 4th scene of the 5th act when the people on stage demand an account of Dido's whereabouts. Voices from the crowd. Fort, fort, gebt Rechenschaft. Wo ist die Königin? Eure Köpfe wollen wir noch auf unseren Wurfspießen sprechen lehren. Sie schleppen die Räte fort, die Wache wehrt und geht mit ab. Unlike Dido, the people are prepared to use force to get their way. However, this is also the approach of Jabez, who has just occupied Carthage and is holding all of Dido's confidence captive. When Dido was still in Carthage, the people did not resort to violence. They want to keep their queen. This underlines the people's loyalty to Dido and also their influence on the choice of the ruler. If they had supported Jabez unconditionally, he could have seized power even without Dido. The will of the people is thus decisive for the entire dramatic conflict and the outcome of the drama. Charlotte von Stein breaks with the taboo of female action and allows Dido to act actively, which represents a countermodel to the ideas of femininity of that time. This contrasts, for example, with Goethe's Iphigenia. Dido is therefore also referred to as anti-Iphigenia. According to Linda Dietrich, it is not Iphigenia but Orestes who provides the political solution to the conflict with his creative reinterpretation of the oracle. Iphigenia's function at the end is to be a signifier of redemption, while the power to act remains in the hands of a still dominant male order. Dido, on the other hand, acts independently and proactively. Furthermore, Charlotte von Stein pairs her protagonist with a second female character, Elissa. Elissa is introduced right at the beginning of the play in the very first scene, so that the drama begins with an intimate conversation between two friends. This creates a doubling of the main character, as both names refer to Dido in ancient literature and are used interchangeably, for example in the Aeneid. This doubling also ensures that there is an actively involved woman when Dido retreats into the wilderness in the fourth act of the drama. Elissa then acts as Dido's unofficial representative and maintains the resistance against Jarbas. At the same time, she too is actively involved, and as she had attempted to flee and follow Dido herself, rather than merely speaking about a possibility. Elissa stands firm against Jarbas by refusing to cooperate with him and by not revealing Dido's whereabouts. At the same time, Elissa also sees herself as fighting in her resistance. Stolz und Liebe stehen sich wohl an, wenn ersterer von der letzten entstanden ist. Aber wenn ihr muss entgegengesetzt werden, ist es ein widriger Kampf. Another difference from Iphigenia is that the latter withdraws into a state of inner exile while simultaneously idolizing her old homeland. Iphigenia's influence on Taurus is limited to the influence she can exert through sympathy. Iphigenia is dependent on Phoebus finding her likable so that her ideas may influence him and be put into practice through him, for example the suspension of the human sacrifices. Iphigenia can only lament that she is a woman and cannot act. Allein der Frauenzustand ist beklagenswert. Zu Hause und in dem Kriege herrscht der Mann und in der Fremde weiß er sich zu helfen. Ihn freuet der Besitz, ihn krönt der Sieg, ein ehrenvoller Tod ist ihm bereitet. Wie eng gebunden ist des Weibes Glück. Schon einem rauen Gatten zu gehorchen ist Pflicht und Trost. Wie elend, wenn sie gar ein feindliches Schicksal in die Ferne treibt. Dido has created a new home for herself in a foreign land, in which she has simultaneously further refined the best of her homeland. Auch Künste und Wissenschaften aus meinem geliebten phönizischen Vaterland schlagen hier Wurzeln, ohne wie dort im übermütigen Tyros auszuarten. While the initial situation of both women is comparable, they have ended up in a foreign land due to unfortunate external circumstances and must defend their enlightened values against barbarians, the scope of their action differs. Iphigenia can only attempt to mediate between the cultures, while Dido can act actively and determine her own fate. Dido is not dependent on being rescued by a man or on receiving permission to leave her country. Dido saves her people herself. The possibility to act distinguishes Dido also from Hildgund by Caroline von Günderrode. In Caroline von Günderrode's drama, Hildgund creates the plan to stab Attila on a wedding night to prevent her wedding and war. Hildgund and Dido thus find themselves in a similar situation. Both women are forced into marriage by kings who threaten war should they refuse, yet the way how the women resolve the situation differs. Neither woman is dependent on men, they would devise their own plans independently in carrying them out. But the tremolette breaks off before the deed is done. It is just hinted as a plan. It remains seen whether Hildgund carries out the plan and whether she is successful. In contrast, Charlotte von Stein has Dido carry out her deed on stage, witnessed by all other characters. This also underlines the seriousness of Dido's role as a female ruler. Dido's female role is also evident in a particular decision she does as queen. Although Dido commits suicide, it is precisely through this act and her self-sacrifice that she saves her people. Even before her plan to commit suicide, Dido lays down her crown and retreats into exile. She appoints one of her brothers as her successor in order to deprive Jarbas of the basis for becoming king himself and to save the people from war and a barbarian. She thus prefers to step down to save her people and protect the enlightened values. When this retreat proves insufficient and she is forced to return to Carthage, Dido is prepared to commit suicide. This suicide can be interpreted ambiguously. Although Dido dies and thus loses her life, this act is successful at the same time and she is able to save her people from a barbarian ruler and combine salvation with her values. According to Ortrud Gutjahr, it is only through this example, through Dido's symbolic self-sacrifice as a public ritual, that her exemplary virtue can be culturally and bindingly attributed to the collective memory of all members of the community. For it is through such an act, celebrated collectively and remembered by all, that a community can be forged into the spirit of humanity. This collective memory ensures that Dido's virtue is passed on. This is, as a matter of fact, already prophesied by the hermit in the 4th act. Die Raserei wird die Torheit lehren und so stürzt ein berühmtes Reich in den Abgrund der Dunkelheit, das durch Jahrhunderte die Geschichte es nicht mehr nennen wird. Deine erhabene Tugend aber wird durch Jahrtausende aufgezeichnet bleiben. Justine's Epitome also describes how Dido was worshipped as a goddess in Carthage because of her deed. Quam Dio Carthago invicta fuit, pro dea culta est. It is precisely this decision by a ruler to put the welfare of the people above her own and to remain true to her rule despite all opposition that makes Dido a role model and a strong, inspiring woman. This also contrasts with a male ruler who would rather go to war than voluntarily relinquish his crown. Dido's rule and her resistance are ultimately successful, for Jabez is defeated. With this portrayal of female rule, Charlotte von Stein resists the traditional image of the time and distances herself from the classics and the classic period such as Goethe and Schiller. This underlines the radical nature of the portrayal of Dido as a ruler. Dido's reign is characterized by kindness, non-violence, and her role as a role model. She is also a role model denouncing the rules for being able to rule as a queen within an enlightened context. Through this manner of ruling, she offers resistance not only against other regimes and her advisors, but also presents an alternative concept of governance to the prevailing ideas of the time. Although she is forced to relinquish her rule, as I have shown, her female leadership had a positive impact on the land and its people and continues to have a lasting effect even after her death. Thank you very much for your listening.